it seems like the trend is towards more complex therapeutic modalities where there are obviously multiple components developed at various academic institutions, small biotechs, et cetera. So this idea of mitigating risk and also of how do you deal with these complex particularly in the therapeutic space, these complex patents and licensing considerations. Would love to hear from maybe Chris initially on your perspective. How do you advise both funders and innovators themselves to think about this? And how do they, especially when you're at an early stage, how do you think about driving forward with development on something, but then also taking into account what licenses you're going to need? Love to hear your
Yeah, it's a major issue, and to echo some of the points that were made early in the process, it's very difficult to know that. Even as something as simple as what is your companion diagnostic going to be? I mean, sometimes you need clinical data to really understand, how that diagnostic is going to be correlated with, whatever your therapeutic path is going to be. So it's difficult as you progress, but it is becoming more and more the norm where, when most, Todd, Michelle, and I all came up, we were still in the world of small molecules and single antibodies, where you had largely a very small number of patents that protected a fairly finite technology like a small molecule or an antibody or even an antibody, some derivative. And so it was fairly straightforward to identify the intellectual property that was needed for that product. Now products are getting incredibly complex. When you look at CAR Ts that have gene circuits in them, where it may have 15 or 16 elements within that gene circuit alone, not to mention the CAR T itself, the methods of manufacturing the CAR T, everything else. You look at ADCs, there are, literally more than a dozen different types of technologies that are within a typical antibody drug conjugate. So if you are looking to develop those sorts of technologies, one of the things that we're working with investors a lot now, and also have had this conversation with a number of tech transfer offices, I think there's two things that I'll focus on, although I think we could talk about this all day. One is the need for institutions, and I'm going to talk directly to government and academic institutions here that need to work together. We've spent a lot of time, I think, in the wake of Bayh-Dole, everyone got set up as an independent economic actor, from every government agency to every single university. Sometimes every single school within a university may have its own tech transfer office. If you look at certain places like Wake Forest and others that have, very fragmented sort of intellectual property development. And so what happens is you have universities, the way I analogize it is they're licensing out one leg of a stool and telling you that you have the intellectual property to make that stool, when you don't. You need the other legs, you need the top, you need supports, whatever it is. And so I think what we're seeing now is much more of an attempt to identify those pieces of intellectual property up front, even if they're coming from disparate institutions, to try to aggregate those either in the company itself, ideally, or in some holding company that would then license those out for fields of use. But I can tell you, I'm in at least three different conversations with three different institutions now, where we're going to be looking at exactly this sort of pre-aggregation. So I think pre-aggregation and then the necessity for everyone to work together in a different way. And anyone who's ever tried to do an interinstitutional agreement between two universities will appreciate the difficulty in getting any two universities to do even the most simple of tasks. So now we need to find new mechanisms, and that some of that may be an economic mechanisms for how do we handle royalty distributions without, we can't stack 3% royalty on 3% royalty on 3% royalty on 3% royalty. So you've got to find a way to create, and I think there's a lot of lessons, just to throw this out there for those of you who are on here who are maybe came out of tech. There's a lot of lessons in tech here in terms of how we handle patent pools, how we created some of these aggregate systems. So I think one of the things that we're also looking at is learning some lessons from tech, which has always had this problem. When you have an iPhone, you have thousands of patents that make up that iPhone. The economics of how that works is incredibly complex. So maybe a long answer to a short question, but.
And Sia, let me follow up, because I completely agree with Chris here. And I also am in the process of working on two different license agreements and with universities. And I'm really pushing back on one because it's essentially a work for hire. And they want 3 and 4% royalties, even though all they're going to do is identify, let's say, a binder, and then we have to develop the binder and put the money and do all the work. So instead of royalties, I'm pushing back on a very low equity percentage, very small. And I'm talking to them about, hey, yeah, this is, but really having the equity reflect what work they have done, the percentage. And there is a big upswing if there's an exit. The other thing I won't, when I do any license agreement at this point, I put in all that boilerplate language about a reduction in royalty fees if indeed we have to add stacking. And I know universities want to limit that, but that limit number I bring down pretty hard, especially if it's like a work for hire, because they really, I mean, it should be reflective of the amount of contribution that is going on.
Yeah. And from working a little bit in the antibody space, there's a lot more they're going to have to do to turn that into a product. So
Right.